Make some noise, the vocal onset. Once you've learned how to line yourself up correctly and take a good breath to sing, the next step, of course, is actually singing. This video is all about the vocal onset, or the start of the sound, which is a pretty tricky part of singing for a lot of singers. The vocal onset starts inside of the larynx, and this actually requires a little bit of a vocabulary lesson, an anatomy lesson, so let me talk a little bit about that. Your vocal cords are located inside of your larynx, and they're sort of oriented like a backwards V, like this, with the open part in the back and the apex here in the front. Together, the vocal cords form what is called the glottis. When you breathe, you open your vocal folds to allow the air to go through. And when you make a sound, you bring your vocal folds together and vibrate them together using air. When you bring your vocal cords together, it's called adduction, like ADD, like to add something. And when you bring them apart, it's called abduction, which comes from the same root word as the word abduct, or to take away. To get a better concept of adduction and abduction, or bringing your vocal cords together and separating them, I recommend practicing this separately from making any vocal sound. And you can do that by making this sound. So that's not a vocal sound, it's not phonated, but you are bringing your vocal cords together and separating them lightly just to get used to that sensation. Go ahead and try that. It almost feels like a gentle clearing of your throat, and all you're doing are bringing those cords together and apart. Another exercise you can do to develop a better kinesthetic awareness of your glottis is practice holding your breath with your vocal cords together and with them apart. If you are into weightlifting, a lot of weightlifters know not to hold their breaths with their glottis closed, with their vocal cords together, because you can actually injure your vocal cords by doing that. So go ahead and bring your vocal cords together and stop your breath. You can feel that the air kind of stops in your throat if you do that. Now take a breath and try and stop the air using your muscles of inspiration, of inhalation, instead of using your vocal cords. When I do that, I feel like the air has stopped much lower, and I feel that it takes more muscular effort in my muscles of inhalation to keep that air from coming out. The 3 types of vocal onset. Forced or glottal onset. Now, this onset is a little bit more pressurized than it needs to be, a little bit more forceful, and is going to tire you out over time if you do it. It's characterized by a crunching sound, So that sound is called a glottal stop, and it's present in English all the time. I've just been using a lot of them. We use them a lot when we have words that start with a vowel. So, for example, if you say, can you hear that crunching sound at the beginning? Go ahead and try doing that on your own as well. That is a glottal stop. Now, of course, they're okay to use if you need to say a word with a glottal stop in them, but you don't want that to necessarily be your default. What's happening inside is that you're bringing your vocal cords together, you're adducting before you start using the breath, and you're putting a little bit of pressure. You're shoving those cords together slightly too hard. I do want to mention that you can have a glottal stop that's relatively gentle. What you don't want is to have a like a big crunchy feeling. That didn't feel good for me vocally when I did that. So you really don't want that to be your default. Breathy onsets. The opposite of a forced onset is a breathy onset, and it actually occurs in the exact opposite way internally. So where a forced onset involves putting too much pressure on those vocal cords, bringing them together early, a breathy onset involves leaving those vocal cords abducted, starting the flow of air, and then bringing them together. The result of that is a ha-H sound. Obviously, again, we have H's in language, and it's totally okay to use them when you're using them in language, but that ha sound requires you to start your air before you bring your vocal cords together, and then you have to bring them together and create a good sound once the air has already started, which is a little bit more technically difficult to do. It's also going to be drying if you put, a lot of people will put H's on the beginnings of all of their words by accident. And if you do that, you can really dry out your vocal cords over time, especially if you're singing over a long period or you're in a dry climate. Balanced onsets. The third type of vocal onset, and the type of vocal onset that we are looking for, is the balanced vocal onset. And the balanced vocal onset, just like it sounds, is neither forced nor breathy. It's where you bring your vocal cords together and start the airflow roughly at the same time. It does require quite a bit of coordination, but you can kind of think of this as if you ride a bike, when you get on that bike and you start moving as soon as the bike is balanced, if you don't coordinate that correctly, you know you're going to fall off. So while it takes a little bit of practice, it does result in the most efficient use of air and the least strain on your vocal folds. So whereas you've got that forced onset that sounds like and a breathy onset that sounds like your balanced onset will sound like neither breathy nor forced. Finding a balanced onset. When you're trying to find that balanced onset, I recommend that you do exactly what I just did, where you try doing a forced onset on purpose, try doing a breathy onset on purpose, and then try to meet in the middle. Think about how that middle ground feels different than your norm and try to pinpoint what your onset is usually like. Do you tend to have a breathy onset? Do you tend to have a forced onset? Or is your onset already pretty good? There are also other factors that may affect your onset that you have to keep in mind, which we'll cover right now. What affects vocal onset? There are a lot of factors that can affect vocal onset in singing, so let's go over some of those so you can keep them in mind as you work on starting your sound. Words. The thing about words is that they're unique to voice, and so they make voice a little bit tricky because they change the length of our vocal tract. Now, the vocal tract is a large part of the resonator of the human voice, extends from the larynx to where the sound comes out, so your nostrils or your mouth. Most instruments, like a piano or a guitar, have a fixed resonator size. Like if you think about the body of the guitar, the body of the piano, they don't change shape, they don't change length. But for us, ours does, and that really affects onset as well as singing. So to explain that, think about two different straws. So I want you to think about a coffee straw with a really small hole, and then a big fat boba or bubble tea straw with a big hole. Which straw do you think you'll be able to blow through for a longer period of time? Probably that skinny coffee straw, right? The reason for that is because you've got back pressure from that little hole. It's just going to take longer for all that air to blow out of there. So that small skinny coffee straw is sort of like doing a more closed sound, like an M or an N that go through your nose, or an ooh, E, sounds like that with a more closed mouth shape. You're going to get a little bit of back pressure on those, and you'll be able to potentially have a more easily balanced onset for most people. Of course, everybody's different, but for most people. Your open vowels, especially ah, are going to be more like that big fat boba straw, where all of a sudden you have to rely a lot more on your muscles of respiration that we worked on in the last video, instead of relying on that back pressure. So keep that in mind as you're practicing your onset. Certain vowels might, not just vowels, but certain phonemes, vowels and consonants, might present a bigger issue for you than others. When you are practicing your vocal onset, like I said, everybody's different. Ah is the most difficult for a lot of people, but it might not be for you. So just think about what sounds are the most difficult for you and kind of keep those on your list. There are different reasons why different sounds can be difficult. For example, G and K start kind of in the back of the tongue, and that can provide some kickback on the larynx that make them harder for some people. So just keep a list, and those are the ones that you're going to want to practice more. Unvoiced consonants. There are certain consonants that don't require any phonation, any vocal sound at all, like F, S, T, T, etc. Right? When you are singing words with these unvoiced consonants, you have to not sing, but form the unvoiced consonant and then immediately go to the next voiced sound. And that requires quite a bit of coordination, which can make for a more difficult onset. So just keep that in mind. If you are having trouble with your vocal onset, think about, does this word start with an unvoiced consonant? That could be a factor. In general, when practicing your vocal onset, think about elongating that vocal tract with 3 different types of sounds. Closed vowels, like E and U. Frontal voiced consonants, or consonants that require voice phonation, like V, B, and D. And humming, or nasal consonants, like N and M, that go through your nose. More challenging vocal onsets might be open vowels like ah, and unvoiced consonants followed by a vowel like p, k, s, and t, for example. Range, register, and volume. Some singers have vocal onset issues that have a lot to do with the range, register, and volume at which they're singing. Now, we're going to be talking about some of this stuff later in this course, so I don't want to get too mired in it now. Range, obviously, is just low notes and high notes. A lot of people have difficulty with high onsets and low onsets. Everything is more difficult in the extremes of your range. So when you're first practicing onsets or first practicing anything vocal, really, stick to something in the middle that feels comfortable. And then as your skills improve, work out toward the bottom and the top. I'm going to cover registers very heavily in a later video, but I want to give you a quick rundown for now, just so you can understand how register might affect your vocal onset, since it's pretty important to understanding this concept, and it can have a big impact on whether your onset goes well or not. So your vocal cords are basically controlled by 2 different sets of muscles. One set of muscles thickens and shortens those vocal folds. And that set of muscles are called the thyroarytenoid muscles, and they are associated with chest voice. Chest voice, with the lower, thicker, shorter vocal folds, is a lower, more robust sound. Most people speak in chest voice. I'm speaking in chest voice right now. Chest voice is also used a lot in contemporary music and belting, and also by male classical singers, most male classical singers. Chest voice onsets. Forced chest voice onset. Breathy chest voice onset. Balanced chest voice onset. Head voice, woo, up here, is governed by the cricothyroid muscles, which lengthen and thin out your vocal folds. So that results in that higher, sort of thinner timbre. And that voice is used a lot. If you think about falsetto, that's like an offshoot of head voice. Female classical singers tend to sing in head voice. You'll hear a lot of head voice in R&B. Certain singers use a lot of it. Forced head voice onset. breathy head voice onset. Balanced head voice onset. Most of the time, both of those sets of muscles, the cricothyroids or the CT muscles, and the thyroretinoid or the TA muscles are working at the same time. And that results in a sound that has qualities of both. So it's sort of a middle register sound that has some of the lightness and ease of head voice, but also a little bit more of that heft and robust timbre of chest voice. I'm actually purposefully speaking in that voice right now, and that voice is called mixed voice. All three of these registers are really important for singing, and your vocal onset might feel different depending on what register you're in. For example, a lot of beginning singers who have started in popular music might have trouble with head voice onsets because they're not used to singing in head voice and they're not used to accessing that upper register. So as you practice your onsets, think about what register you're in. If you've got that more robust timbre, or if you're singing in a more head voice timbre, or if you're somewhere in the middle, and think about whether or not that's affecting the efficacy of your onset. A quick hack for telling what register you're in. Chest voice is called chest voice because it's got some real chest resonance. You feel vibration in your chest when you're speaking in chest voice. So go ahead and put your hands on your sternum and make a nice, robust chest voice sound. So right now I'm speaking in a really chest dominant way. I feel a lot of vibration here. If I were to go up, woo, into head voice, that vibration completely goes away. And if you're in mixed voice, it'll be somewhere in the middle where there's still some vibration, but not nearly as much. So if you get confused about which register you're in, that should help you out. Just like the high and low of the register are maybe the hardest parts to coordinate, super loud and super quiet sounds can also be very hard to coordinate. When you're first practicing onset, you might want to stick to a mezzo forte, like a middle dynamic that's fairly easy for you to coordinate. And then as you get more skilled, practice doing softer onsets and louder onsets. If you find that you're having trouble, think about whether maybe you're approaching this too loud or too quietly and make an adjustment to make it more comfortable. Tension and vocal dysfunction. One thing that I've already touched on a couple of times during this course, during the stance and breathing videos, is tension. Tension makes everything a lot harder when it comes to singing, and that definitely applies to the vocal onset. If you have a lot of tension around your larynx and your external neck muscles, which we're going to get into that a lot more later in this course, you might find that your vocal onset is not working really well. If that's the case, you can skip ahead to the dead zone external neck muscle and laryngeal tension sections, and hopefully that will help you to relax those areas a little bit so you can have a better time with your vocal onset and with singing in general. In extreme cases, the inability to get a clear onset might be a symptom of a vocal issue that you need to go see a doctor for, a medical issue. So if you have any of these symptoms, please consider going to see an ENT. If you have a lack of clear onset during speech, if your voice is constantly raspy or becomes raspy by the end of the day, or if it hurts to form that vocal onset to either talk or sing. General onset exercises. Just like with stance and breathing, I do recommend that at first, when you're learning about the vocal onset, you spend some concentrated practice time, just 5 minutes or so a day, in front of the mirror practicing this. But it's also really easy to incorporate some onset practice into your day because it doesn't have to be on a specific pitch or volume necessarily. Here's my step-by-step process for practicing your onsets. First, you have to figure out which onsets present some difficulty for you. Do you tend to do breathy or pressed onsets? Are there registers, ranges, or phonemes that are especially difficult for you? The more you know, the more empowered you are to improve. So figure that out first. Then, when you have a free moment, place a hand on your neck gently, don't squeeze, to help yourself stay relaxed. Take a silent breath. This is kind of like the surprise breath that we talked about in the breathing video. And then speak the tricky syllable in the intended range or register. Let me give you a quick example. Like I said, ah can be difficult for people because of that short vocal tract, and for a lot of beginner singers who are coming from a popular music background, head voice is very unfamiliar. So I'm going to try an ah in head voice using this process. Ah. Oh. If it doesn't go well, go back to that adduction feeling so you can feel where your vocal cords are. Swallow to reset your larynx, and then try it again a couple times, making sure not to push. You can also go back to an easier register, phoneme, etc. to help yourself get back on. So for example, if that ah and head voice isn't working out so well, try it in chest voice instead, and then move back into head voice. If you're struggling to get that sound out at all, you can always go to an aspirate onset or that H, breathy onset, to get things going. Ha is a lot easier for a lot of people at first than ah, so that might just help you to get the ball rolling a little bit. In general, remember that it's the breath that vibrates the vocal cords rather than the vocal cords muscularly vibrating themselves. It takes basically no muscular effort that you can feel here in order to get that going. So if you feel like there's a lot going on here, focus back on that breath instead. Practice making a sound with breath engagement, taking a good breath like we talked about in the breathing video. And then using that to form a nice onset sound. One fun exercise for onset and for breath support in general, which we'll get to later, is the Santa laugh. Ho, ho, ho. That's also really helpful if you have issues with head voice in particular. We're using that aspirate or breathy onset to help you to get up into head voice comfortably. Ho also goes to that closed vowel, which is helpful for the vocal tract. When you're doing this, make sure that you're taking that good breath and that you feel a kind of pulse with each onset. Ho, ho, ho. Listen for breathy onsets that ha sound at the beginning, which may result in a breathy sound continuing through the note. Tense onsets, you may get that crunchy sound at the beginning, and it can result in a tense, kind of squeezed sound through the rest of the phrase. No good. Balanced, you'll get a clear, easy beginning that's neither pressed nor breathy, followed hopefully by a clear tone. Feeling. On the breathy onset, you might feel a rapid deflation in your abdomen if you put your hand on your belly while you're doing a breathy sound. Whoo, you might feel a zoom in. A tense onset, you might feel a tight feeling in your throat, especially when you do the glottal at the beginning. On a balanced onset, hopefully you'll see no perceivable movement in your torso or your neck. Next time, we'll talk about what happens after you do that nice balanced onset, which is actually singing.